What's up, everyone? In this video we are going to be listening to the story about, and I heard about this years ago, Woody Harrelson's dad, who was a hired hitman. Woody Harrelson's dad was a salesman and a hitman. It's a true story. Woody Harrelson found out and everything, but yeah, before we get started, please subscribe if you're new to the channel. It means so much to me. I can't put into words. And to all my subscribers, thank you so much. I hope you're doing good, and let's get started.
First U.S. federal judge assassinated in the 20th century was the Honorable John H. Wood, Jr. of Texas. His killer, Charles Boyd Harrelson, would eventually receive 2 life sentences for the crime. Charles is also the father of actor Woody Harrelson. Today we're going to take a look at Charles Harrelson, encyclopedia salesman, hitman, and father of Woody Harrelson. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, please leave a comment and let us know what other true crime related topics you would like to hear about. Okay, time to meet Woody's dad. Charles Harrelson was born in the town of Lovelady, Texas, on July 23, 1938. When he was old enough, he enlisted in the United States Navy and continued to serve until 1959. After being discharged, he moved to Los Angeles, where he worked multiple jobs, including encyclopedia salesman and professional gambler. He also met Diane Lou Oswald, the woman who would become his wife. During this time, Charles began a steady descent into what would become a life of crime. He would be arrested for the first time at the age of 21, and by the age of 35, he would be serving his first stretch in prison. Charles and Diane eventually moved to Houston, Texas, where they had 3 boys, Woody, Brett, and Jordan. The family, however, wouldn't last. Charles divorced Diane in 1965 and married his next wife, Betty. Things got worse from there. Charles kept gambling and wound up in debt to several organized crime outfits. Then, in 1968, he was arrested for armed robbery. The charges wouldn't stick, and Charles wouldn't stick around. He abandoned his family and disappeared into the criminal underworld. Woody was in elementary school at the time. Despite being so young, he knew his father had serious problems. Years later, the actor would recall in interviews that even prior to his parents' separation, his father was constantly in and out of jail and was rarely around. In order to pay off the considerable gambling debts he had accumulated, Charles Harrelson became a hired hitman. His first alleged hit came in...
I didn't know that's how he became a hitman. So if he didn't owe, crime bosses or people in the mafia, money, and he probably would have never become a hitman to pay off his debts. They're probably like, do this job or we'll kill you. I didn't know that part.
In 1958, and the target was Alan Berg, a carpet salesman from the Houston area. This killing, which would later be the subject of the book Run, Brother, Run, a memoir of a murder in my family by Berg's brother David, was allegedly contracted by a business rival for the price of $1,500. In his book, David Berg alleges that Charles used his then-girlfriend, Sandra Sue Attaway, to lure Alan into a car where Harrelson then ambushed him. Alan was forced at gunpoint to drive to a remote location where Harrelson shot him in the head. Then, just to be sure the job was done, Harrelson strangled the wounded man. In 1970, Charles was put on trial for the murder of Alan Berg. During the trial, his lawyer called several alibi witnesses who must have convinced the jury because Harrelson was acquitted. David Berg, in the years since, has disputed this testimony and steadfastly maintained that Charles Harrelson was his brother's killer. Pete Thomas Scamardo was a grain broker who also happened to run a drug smuggling business. His partner in that heroin business was one Sam DeGelia Jr., but when Sam lost a large shipment during a traffic stop in Kansas City, Pete decided to end the partnership. To this end, Scamardo paid Charles Harrelson $2,000 to bump off DeGelia. Charles was arrested for the crime, and at the trial, he was represented by famed defense attorney Percy Foreman. The lawyer found a nightclub singer who was willing to testify that Charles was with her at the time of the murders. The jury hung, and Charles was granted a retrial. The retrial would go differently. Seeking to avoid a charge of perjury, the nightclub singer fled the country and wasn't available to testify a second time. Without her, Charles's defense fell apart, and he was convicted. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but only wound up serving 5 thanks to earning time off for good behavior. After Charles Harrelson had abandoned his family, Woody, his mother, and siblings moved to Lebanon, Ohio. Along with his brothers, young Woody had absolutely no contact with his father after 1968. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1973 that the future natural-born killer star would learn about his father's trial for the DeGelia murder. According to Woody, he found out from the radio. He was in a car waiting for a friend of his mother who was picking him up from school when he overheard a news report about Charles V. Harrelson and his trial for murder. The 12-year-old boy figured there probably weren't 2 men with that name, so it must be his father. He would later describe it as a wild realization. Charles Harrelson spent the years 1973 through 1978 serving time in prison for the DeGelia homicide. After being released, it didn't take long for him to get back to his old tricks. In 1979, Jamil Jimmy Chagra was a drug lord and a member of the Dixie Mafia. He was also on trial for trafficking and facing a potentially long sentence. As if that wasn't bad enough, the federal judge presiding over his trial was John H. Wood Jr., who was known by the nickname Maximum John. If you guessed he got that nickname from always handing out maximum sentences, you're one clever cookie, and you understand why Jimmy decided the judge had to be whacked before the trial ended. For the price of $250,000, Chagra hired Charles Harrelson to eliminate Judge Wood. On Tuesday, May 29, 1970, in San Antonio, Texas, Judge Wood was walking out of his house to head for work when he noticed his car had a flat tire. As he bent down to examine the flat, Charles Harrelson approached and shot him in the back of the skull with a high-powered rifle. Wood perished instantly, making him the first federal judge to be assassinated in the 20th century. Costing over $11 million, the investigation into the murder of Judge Wood was the most expensive of its kind in FBI history. There was no physical evidence that pointed to who the shooter might be, but investigators had their eye on Jimmy Chagra. Even with Judge Wood dead, Chagra was facing 30 years in prison for drug trafficking. After recording over 1,000 separate conversations Chagra had in his jail cell, the FBI pieced together what happened. Charles Harrelson's trial lasted 40 days and included the presentation of 130 witnesses and over 300 exhibits. When all was said and done, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for the murder, plus an additional 5 years. At the same time, his then-wife, Joanne Harrelson, was sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy. Turns out she had purchased the murder weapon for Charles under an assumed name. By the way, Jimmy Chagra, the man who started it all, he was acquitted. And justice for all.
Do you love Gantt charts? Here's how easily you can build one in ClickUp.
In his life, Charles Harrelson was tried for 3 contract killings and convicted of 2. However, if you believe the man himself, that's just the tip of a very scary iceberg. Harrelson claims to have killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 50, yes, 50 people on behalf of various organized crime figures. That's a lot of people. Despite the confession, not everyone believes him. While serving time for the killing of Judge Wood, Charles sent a letter to a man named Kenny Gallo, a former mob associate who, at the time, was hiding via the FBI witness relocation program. Harrelson told Gallo that he was planning to write a book that would reveal the truth behind all of his crimes. However, the ex-mobster wasn't convinced. According to Gallo, Harrelson likely killed more than 2 people, but nowhere near 50. He said Charles may have been involved in that many killings, maybe driving the car or something, but he only carried out maybe 6 killings himself. If Gallo was skeptical, it might be because Harrelson had a habit of confessing to things he didn't do. For example, in 1980, after a standoff with the police, Charles Harrelson was arrested for the murder of Judge Wood. During that standoff, Charles amazingly confessed to the police that he was, in fact, the true assassin of President John F. Kennedy. Of course, he was high out of his mind on cocaine at the time, so take it for what it's worth. We've all been there, right? Law enforcement, for their part, didn't buy it, and Charles himself later admitted it was just a lie he hoped would incentivize the police not to shoot him on the spot. A 1988 documentary about the Kennedy assassination features an interview with Harrelson, in which he explains he wasn't even in Dallas on the day Kennedy died. He was in Houston. Despite these retractions, there are those who still believe his initial confession. The character Woody Boyd from Cheers came from the town of Hanover, Indiana. The actor Woody Harrelson went to school at Indiana's Hanover College, and that's where he was when he learned about his father's trial for the murder of Judge Wood. Woody was 20 years old at that point, and his father had played no role in his upbringing. Nonetheless, Woody decided to reach out to Charles. It wasn't easy, but the two men slowly began to build a relationship, and in 1987, Woody served as a proxy for Charles in his 4th marriage. In an interview with People magazine a year later, Woody said that he looked at Charles as more of a potential friend than a father, and he was still gauging whether the man merited his loyalty. In 1995, with the help from 2 convicted bank robbers, Charles Harrelson used makeshift ropes to scale the wall of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Unfortunately for Charles and his cohorts, the guards in the prison tower immediately figured out what was going on and fired a warning shot. All 3 convicts were quickly recaptured. As punishment, Charles was transferred to ADX Florence, a supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, known as one of the nation's most secure facilities. Strangely, Harrelson didn't mind. He may have even liked it there. In a letter to a friend, he said, "The silence is wonderful, and feeling left alone is great. Nobody bothers me." Charles Harrelson would spend the rest of his life denying the slaying of Judge Wood. He insisted that on the day of the shooting, he was miles away, in Dallas. Still later, he would claim that he had been working with a professional gambler named George Kay to con Jimmy Chagra out of the $250,000 bounty by merely taking credit for the killing. Woody Harrelson would help Charles try to get a new trial. Their plea was based on the fact that Charles's conviction rested on the testimony of prisoners who were all offered reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. Woody described this effort as just being a son trying to help his dad. The appeal stalled, and Charles Harrelson died of a heart attack in 2007. He was 69. So what do you think? Does this story make you look at Woody any differently? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.
No, but until I found out that he tried to get his murdering hitman father a new trial. I don't know. Whatever. I was never a big Woody Harrelson fan anyway. But even if I was, I would be disappointed. Not angry or sad, just disappointed in stupidity. There's enough stupid Hollywood celebrities out there. Anyways, if you didn't know that about Woody Harrelson's father, well, there you go. He was a deadbeat dad and a man who killed people. And he's burning in hell. So, haha. Take care. Be safe. Peace, everyone.